Hello, and welcome to our panel discussion, European Regions, Progress in Literary Culture. I'm Andrew Singer of Trafika Europe Radio, and it's my great good pleasure to be joined by three friends in the studio here, Tess Lewis, Milena Deleva, and Burhan Sönmez. And if I can, let me just introduce each of these briefly. Tess Lewis, you're a translator from French and German. You have won many awards for your work, including a PEN Translation Prize, Austrian Culture Forum, New York Translation Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship. You're presently, if I'm not mistaken, co-chair of the PEN America Translation Committee, and you're an advisory editor for the Hudson Review. Milena Deleva, you have a background in cultural studies. You've worked extensively researching, managing, developing projects in the field of arts and culture, and nowadays, you run the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation, which promotes Bulgarian literature in the Anglosphere with a whole slew of activities. And Burhan Sönmez, principally, I know you as an author, and you also have worked as a lawyer in the field of human rights. You're a political exile to Britain, but you are born and raised as a Turkish-Kurd. And you've written on literature and politics for such publications as The Guardian, Der Spiegel, La Repubblica, and you are a brilliant novelist. We had the great good pleasure of publishing an excerpt of your fourth novel, Labyrinth, in Trafika Europe. You're a member of several PEN organizations, and you're a board member of PEN International. So we couldn't hope for a more informed and engaged panel of participants here for our topic. Before we get to our discussion, let me just say a little bit more about what our topic is and why we're here talking about it. So the title of our panel is European Regions, Progress in Literary Culture. We have a kind of blurb about it, which I'll read. In the light of recent political and economic trends, counter to a more unified Europe, panelists here are going to assess progress culturally and consider new approaches and understandings of European literary cultures and regions. And let me just put in a shameless plug here. Aiming for a new infrastructure for European literature, our project, including the Trafika Europe Radio initiative, seeks to foster greater openness and mutual regard among European literary communities toward a more shared European identity. So Trafika Europe is a project showcasing European literature from across the 47 Council of Europe countries. We have a very strongly cultural focus rather than a political focus on Europe. And really, there's only a handful of organizations working in literature on the pan-European level, perhaps surprising. It's a vast territory. There is as yet very little shared understanding and infrastructure toward any notion of belonging together across this vast territory of 750 million people, pretty much the whole continent of Europe. So we're here to consider where we might be going with this. And the Trafika Europe project seeks to just curate a space online in the sure understanding that somehow it matters, to clear some ground and attract people across Europe just based on literary values and mastery in literature. But each of us has a different perspective in this. So Tess Lewis is coming to this as principally as a translator and also with specialty for French and German regions. Milena is coming to this principally as a cultural organizer and principally from Bulgaria and the wider region there. And Burhan Sönmez is in the UK with a background in Turkey as a Turkish-Kurd and coming from this also from the point of view of an author, a European author, a novelist. So we each bring some different things to the table here. Let me start out by asking you all, what is the context in which we're having this conversation? What briefly maybe are some of the obstacles to a more united, a more unified and self-delighted Europe in literary culture? And maybe we can start with Tess. What's missing? Where are we at so far?
I think that we are at a very significant and important inflection point right now. Of course, because of the pandemic, hasn't so much changed the situation as it has heightened qualities, both good and bad. And the key underlying factor, the elephant in the room in many of these conversations, is cultural funding. We can talk about European identity, we can talk about literary traditions, but especially from a translator's point of view, and I'm sure Milena would agree in terms of trying to promote cultures from around the world in the Anglosphere, the source funding is crucial. So we are looking at a devastated cultural landscape in terms of funding across Europe and, of course, in the United States and Britain. However, just before we reached this crisis point, I noticed in the German language literary world and the French literary world that the understanding of what national traditions meant was becoming much more inclusive. The Germans have always been particularly hospitable to writers who write in German as a second or third language acquired late in life or as a child, first, second, third generation immigrants. The Swiss, who are adept at navigating their way through their 4 national languages, have increased their internal funding, not just for writers, Swiss writers who write in one of their national languages, but also writers who come from the wave of immigrants, both after 1989 and more recently from around the world. In addition, to qualify for funding as a Swiss writer, you don't necessarily have to be Swiss. If you live in Switzerland for, I believe it's 3 years, they consider you as contributing to the culture, and there are various stipends that are available for you. So I think that even in this very dark hour, when all budgets are going to be slashed right and left, there are grounds for hope that cultural institutions, governments, and the public will embrace a broader definition of what culture means in everyday life and who defines culture, who decides what is available, who decides what's getting funded, and how is it consumed, whether in a theater, online, in a book. So it's an enormous area, but I see grounds for hope as well as reasons for concern.
I just want to comment on that before we hear from the others, because just before his passing last autumn, I had a chance to interview the publisher of Dalkey Archive Press, John O'Brien, and I asked him this question. Dalkey Archive is one of the preeminent publishers of European experimental and other works in English, and he went on and on about how it was a funding issue, and I kept trying to steer him to get him to say something more about cultural issues, and he was quite adamant. No, it's funding. So I certainly hear you about that.
Just one caveat, and it's interesting. I was listening to Lewis Hyde speak recently, and he wrote a very important book in the 80s called The Gift, and it's exactly about this. It's how do you have an active artistic life when you live in a society that either doesn't choose to fund a vibrant cultural scene or doesn't have the resources to. So I do agree that it is about funding, and yet there are other avenues that unfortunately involve sacrifices.
There are other avenues. Let's stay for a moment still with the obstacles. Are there other obstacles? What do others think here?
Hi, first of all, thank you for having me. It's really great to be here with all of you. And speaking to your question, Andrew, about the obstacles of the current context, in the context of our topic, literary culture, I think there are many more factors here that define our literary cultures from the point of the Elizabeth Kustova Foundation and our work, translators in terms of Bulgarian into different languages, markets and state support is one thing. And one other very important factor is mobility. And here I would like to echo Tess, because it was actually really affected by the current crisis. The mobility, the arts mobility and the cultural exchange, specifically when it comes to small languages, was really badly affected, because this is how we can form naturally occurring evolution of literary culture. And we can speak in depth about it.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here with you. I think we will talk about so many different aspects of this matter, but I'd like to touch about being introduced to other languages. At the moment, we can say we have bigger opportunity in comparison with writers, for example, 100 years ago, but still the opportunity is very limited. Now, I live in the UK, and I see, for example, in the UK, the portion of the translated fiction published here is just 5%, while it's nearly 20% in France, higher maybe in Bulgaria and Turkey. But language-wise, now English language is maybe the global language at the moment in the world, and in Britain they open only 5% space for other literatures, for the literature of the world. We have to discuss about this not only as a market issue, as valuing the literature, what we mean by the literature of the world or literature of Britain or European literature. There are three famous texts about this discussion. The first one was by Goethe 200 years ago when he published his big work, West Eastern Divan. He was in the hope that, okay, the era of world literature to emerge. But after 200 years, we are still cannot say that we are in the dream that he once had. The other text about this communication between different literatures came from Frederick Jameson in 1986. He wrote about the third world literature by saying that third world literature is limited and mainly allegoric. I come from a third world country, for example. Whatever I write, even I write about the psychology of an individual or about the love story of a couple, still it will be seen as a political allegory of my nation or my country, according to Jameson. It defines this as a negative element, and that caused big debates. But about 10 years before Jameson, in 1970s, two French philosophers wrote something better in my view, closer to my ideas. Deleuze and Guattari wrote a book about Kafka's literature, and they coined the term minor literature, the theory of minor literature. It's not the literature of being little or small. By minor literature, they meant, in the example of Kafka, if you are not allowed in general, or if you don't have opportunity to write in your own language, on your culture, and then you use the major language, like German, in Kafka's example, as a from a small Jewish community from Prague, then you are creating your minor literature in a major language. That's a step, and also that's a way to step into that literature of, we can call now literature maybe. Of course, Guattari and Deleuze don't go that far, but I think we should go now that boundaries. We have to talk about it. Minor languages, minor literatures, and boundaries of nations and boundaries of literature. That's, I think, now the point that I should stop here. Then we can carry on.
Yeah, these are all good points. So we've sketched out a ground of problems and obstacles. I don't feel as strongly as you might, Burhan, that we haven't achieved anything like a world literature. I have been interviewing a lot of authors in the last year, and many of the same names come up over and over again in authors from many different cultures in terms of who are their influences, who are their models, who do they love, what's their inspiration. And that has struck me more than anything, that there is an international currency of masterful writers. And that's something that gives me hope. I also find that if we have as a mindset that it is our natural evolution as cultures in this age to be growing closer and more interactive and more together and with a more shared identity as we grow, if we have that as an expectation, and I do, then the problem space transforms into, okay, how can we curate a space for this to occur naturally? How can we just simply allow our natural evolution as cultural beings to continue to grow in what I think is our naturally programmed evolutionary direction, more together, more interactive, more toward each other? And so with that spirit in mind, I want to now turn to maybe some more positive aspects of the question and see what you think about this transformative possibility. What are our tools and our strengths in this process, as you see it?
I would like to answer that, but also take up Burhan's point, which I think is absolutely crucial. So one way that we have in the past achieved a sort of synthesizing or broadening effect is that there have been And I'll speak for the English language literary world right now, because you have to start somewhere. And that is the major force of internationalizing the literary conversation in the United States, and by extension in Britain, in the 1970s through mid-90s, were figures like Susan Sontag. She could anoint W.G. Sebald or Danilo Kish, or all of a sudden they became these figures that you mentioned, Andrew, being cited again and again. That was one mechanism. We don't have the concentrated literary world or the tastemakers or gatekeepers, if you will. Now, with the democratization of the internet, both good and bad, we have influencers and so forth. So I think what is crucial is to find a way to foster international or literary conversation, cultural conversation on an international level that is inclusive and not exclusive. I also think Burhan made a very important point talking about minor literatures moving into dominant languages. And I translated the Slovenian Austrian writer Maja Haderlap, who wrote a novel about her family in the Slovenian speaking community in Carinthia. And she decided to write it in German, to get this forgotten story of European history to a broader audience. She was embraced by the German-speaking world and reviled by many of the Slovene Corinthians. Choosing a language is always a political decision, particularly if you write in a small language. And it would be, I think, a crucial step to find a way to lift the political burden and balance it out with cultural opportunities and interest and curiosity. I hope that's positive. It's not in a positive way.
It's a valid point. It's an interesting point. Burhan is coming from the experience where his ethnically native language was not even permitted to him in public, in schooling. And so it's a very different imprinting of the problem state, perhaps more intractable from that point of view. I do agree with something you hinted at earlier, Tess, that shifting away from the economic frame for this is potentially a way forward. And just to give a brief example, Trafika Europe is non-commercial. We're an educational foundation. And so one time I did a podcast conversation with a great Ukrainian poet woman. And we had a terrific live interpreter present with us. And she spoke in paragraphs. It was so beautiful. And the live interpreter was up to the task of interpreting her in whole paragraphs. She just spoke for minutes at a time, and then the interpreter faithfully rendered it beautifully in English. Most commercial radio is going to cut that by overdubbing it, and we'll hear an English language version of that with 10 or 15 seconds of the original. But I found it so beautiful, I just spontaneously decided, let's edit it as a fully bilingual episode. I didn't think much of it, but we didn't have any restriction on doing that, and I found it beautiful. So we just did it. And we put it out that way. We published it as an audio interview. And some months later, I found that that interview that we had done was now being used in Ukraine to teach advanced English in schools, because here was one of the great beloved master poets of Ukraine, and they could hear her expressing herself beautifully in Ukrainian, which they could immediately understand, and then hear it the same in English. This was an unintended consequence, but it was an opportunity because we didn't have an economic bottleneck. We didn't have that frame. We didn't accept that there was an economic frame. Similarly, I suggest we can choose not to accept, and I know this is complex and challenging, but I think part of the transformation that's here as an opportunity is that we can reject also that political frame. You're saying that others will regard the language you choose to write in or the topic you choose as a novel to be inherently political. That's an external opinion from someone else. But it's not your opinion. You're writing an alchemy of the spirit, Burhan, when you write a novel. I see it so clearly when I read it. That's what attracts me to it, is that aspect of it. It is transformative, what you're doing. So I think we just need to clear the ground so that you have the right as an author to declare this is not political, this is literature, and to encourage a regrounding of culture and literature as it was in a previous generation in this new shared internet space, to reclaim that part of the media spectrum for literature, qua literature, knowing how valuable that is for all of us. Milena?
If I may ask Burhan actually a question. So you, as an author who has been translated in many languages, more than 40, correct me if I'm wrong, do you have ever any preference in terms of what languages you'd like to see your books translated first, or where they work better? Or do you sometimes think that you being translated by a publisher because you are labeled as a part of a region or some politics?
Oh, yeah. That was the questions, I was thinking a lot in the beginning when my books started to be translated into other languages. I think one of my first travels to Italy. Then, first of all, I wanted to see how people interpret or how people understand my book from other cultures. Because I come from Kurdish origin. I mostly write the feeling and the sensation of Kurdish people coming from my small village, but writing in the major language, Turkish, in my region. And I always thought that my books would be interpreted in a different way in different countries. But I went to a school and then to a prison visit in Italy. In both places, I was answering some questions, and then I realized that I already answered those questions when I was in Turkey in different cities. Now, this is something positive. I'd like to now maybe repeat Andrew's words in a positive way. I think we are now entering in the zone of world literature now. That's not just because of the writers or publishers or translators. It's also because of new reader type. Because we have a global reader now, I believe. Our feelings, our approaches, our knowledge is getting global at the moment. Because we got everything to learn, to hear, and even to speak with other people. So we don't need to see them. Just go on social media and say something. And this opportunity, creating common sense, common approach, and of course, common stupidities as well. So many foolishness all around the world, we know, especially in political and also in literature, but we can handle them. And there are some problems, funny and also interesting. Literature is something, let's say, it's an invisible creature with feathers. A writer, for example, Dostoevsky, if you read his political writings, you wouldn't like it. For myself, I wouldn't like him. He's typical narrow-minded nationalist, hating other people who are not Russian, especially against Europe. But now his literature is outside Russia, in Europe, all around the world. Maybe he couldn't dream that. He's a world writer now for us. That's something great. So when I read Dostoevsky, it doesn't matter in what language he wrote in. Is it Russian? He wrote in literature. That was the language we all share when it comes to that kind of political. Of course, there are some obstacles, some problems. For example, Kafka, one of the two biggest wishes Kafka had was not to see any picture or drawings of insects on his book of Metamorphosis. Now, in every country, go 100 countries, you will always see, a copy of Metamorphosis with the design of an insect on the cover. Even Kafka is cornered. Now, I'm always quoting this because I'm having something similar. My third novel, Istanbul, being translated into more than 40 languages. With a couple of exceptions, maybe. All publications similarly have got the same cover. They all have a mosque. My book is not about mosque. It's about left-wing activists. It's a political novel, and also it's about the urban philosophy of Istanbul. But they all put mosque. Then my following book, Labyrinth, being published now, I think, nearly 30 countries. It has nothing to do with the mosque or with religion. Nearly all of them has got photo or a design of mosque on the cover. Is it because I come from Turkey or because I come from a Muslim country? In the beginning, it was a bit bothering me. And then I said, okay, we are not Kafka. Okay, he had chance to escape it. If you couldn't escape it, you couldn't escape either. So that kind of problems, I've been dealing with, but I'm very much optimistic, I have to say.
I want to take this point and run with it a little, and I want to turn it inside out, if I may, by way of addressing a question specifically to Milena, firstly, Milena, because Burhan is describing a phenomenon of being typed as a Turkish writer for marketing purposes. I want to turn that question of identity inside out and say, Milena, for example, you have done a lot of cultural organizing and cultural studies with Bulgarian literature. What is the issue of internationalizing from an internal perspective? At what point does the process of coming to share more an identity in literature as a writer, as a cultural person, become viewed as a threat, become viewed as a homogenization, become viewed as a weakening of the cultural identity and causing reactions, knee-jerk reactions, or this kind of thing? Is that an issue in European cultures, and how can that be navigated a little more transformatively and positively going forward?
That's a tough question, an obstacle, but it's certainly there. So I can only agree that actually the economic supremacy is there and that politics are there of translation, and it's very difficult to get by them. But I will once again be in praise of exchange, because based on my experience with Elizabeth Kostler Foundation for 12 years, that's really groundbreaking. When persons meet on human level, kindred spirits meet, and then there are so many spillovers of this cultural exchange. I will mention our Suzopo fiction seminars, which has led to many translations and publications of Bulgarian authors in magazines and less by publishing houses, but it's still for a small language. And I'm really quantifying this. This is a big deal. In answer of your question, also, I'll mention something that is actually changing, and I think it's a positive change. I have seen this meaning effort of specifically Anglophone publishers to brand Bulgarian literature like this culture of ontology also works similarly to brand it as Eastern European literature. So it sells better. And also, I think from my experience, the Anglophone editors, they work with Imagine readers, which is also a function of this invisible market. If I can compare, the Anglophone editor will be one step closer to the imagined reader or to the market compared to a Bulgarian editor who works with the author. The Bulgarian editor would be closer to the author. I don't know what's Tess' experience in this regard, but from my modest experience, it's one thing, yeah.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think we need to make a distinction that is absolutely true for the big five publishers. I've just done a book with a subsidiary of Random House, and it's all about the imagined reader. It's about marketing. It's about targeting. They have decided who the book is going to appeal to. But a publisher like Archipelago Books, my experience crafting the cover, the jacket copy of a book for Archipelago Books, it's strictly about Jill Schoolman, the founder and publisher's vision of what the book means to her as a book, as a text. It's nice. I think that's the exception that proves the rule, but I absolutely agree with you, Milena.
Yeah, another identity also trend, it's the Balkan region, of course, but the thing is that the Balkan region is shrinking as well. So now you see programs supported by the EU that are for cultural exchange with the Western Balkans. In a way, the Balkans are now the Western Balkans solely. But I cannot speak about trends because really I can maybe count this on my fingers. But when I was looking at the numbers of the translations supported by the National Fund Culture, there was no English translation, and there were many languages from the neighboring regions, neighboring countries. And specifically, there was very high interest for translation from Bulgarian into Macedonian. And the second one was from Bulgarian into Turkish. So I think these are also nationally occurring collaborations that have to do with mobility and exchange, because it's easier to move around in the region. It's also cheaper. So I think it's complex, and I definitely see positive trends when it comes to exchange. And also one positive outcome of COVID, I say that without any cynicism, is that actually in terms of Bulgaria, the national government invested much more in culture. They tripled their support for literature as well, not only for export, but also for authors who reside in the country, which is strange in a way, because it seems that the resources are there, but we need to crash into the crisis so they will tap into these resources. But solely the state is not enough if there is no interest from the outside world. So in the context of my work, I can relate to literary culture inside and exported literary culture for literature and translation, which, like Burhan mentioned in the beginning, the 5% in the UK, as here in US is known as 3%. Now it's a bit, I think we are above 3%, thanks to the efforts of translators like Tess herself. But yeah.
Yeah, I forgot to mention at the beginning that yourself, Tess, and myself are all in and around New York at this moment for this conversation, and Burhan is coming to us from Cambridge, UK. You know, Milena, this idea of a regional identity as a through way to these larger questions is an interesting one. Politically, it's so double-edged because you have regional strengthening of identity to the point where they no longer feel a larger identity to the nation state. Perhaps it becomes a breakaway culture or mentality or something like this. That's the double edge of it politically. And sometimes culture is then marshaled to that political end. But at the same time, these regional identities, I think they're strengthening in this last generation exactly because there's motivation both from the top down and from the bottom up. From the bottom up, we do have this longing for a re-anointed local, very local regional identity, and as opposed to the nation states, which were also often created in very complex circumstances politically. And from the top down, you have internationalists who want to see slightly weakened, centralized national governments exactly so that they can become a little more internationalized through that method. So from the top point of view, it weakens national governments in a positive way by having regional identities. And from the bottom point of view, it strengthens local identity. I think of Robert Frost's quote in this kind of situation. He said, "Only when love and need are one is the deed ever really done." And so this kind of strengthening of regional identities is one of those. The love and the need are both there. It's an interesting phenomenon and definitely one that's gotten a lot of attention in Europe in the last generation or so. Burhan, Milena has been talking about, or is coming from, Bulgarian culture. And I know from our previous discussion that you're maybe a fan of The Physics of Sorrow by Georgy Gospodinov. And so what's your take on that novel? When you read that, are you reading a Bulgarian author? Are you reading a European author? Are you reading a regional author?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. First, maybe I have to just say something about what Tess and Milena mentioned. I think we writers, if we having chance to become international, that's not just because of our writing. Nowadays, it's mainly thanks to translators and those institutions, foundations that support literature and culture. And in every country, in every region, it's good to see the number of that kind of foundations and institutions now getting more and more, because otherwise writers cannot do anything to get out of their own country. I speak English, but I cannot speak 40 languages. I cannot travel every country. Tolstoy had chance to travel to France, but now so many writers just stay home in their town and they write. Maybe they share something on social media with their own language. But thanks to those people who are creating the big family of literature, because the literature is not only just two end road. One end is writer, the other end is reader. It's a long way, and there are so many other peoples on that path. I think we have to always state that point, also mentioning literary agents. They are doing great things, I believe. And then, okay, then thanks to translators and literary agents that I had the opportunity to read Gospodinov's book. And luckily then, in the same year, then I met him. We We were part of the same literary festival in Istanbul. I wanted to read a book from a writer from Bulgaria. But when I read it, I said, no, he's not Bulgarian. He's someone like me from Turkey who knows the right deserts of Anatolia and also who has got whole knowledge of Istanbul's history and also has got knowledge of whole world literature. Then I said, no, he's not from my country. He's from other part of Mediterranean. There is another continent we can call Mediterranean. No, and then now I say no. He's from a place we call world, from that planet. Thanks to literature that now we see so many writers. It's not because of the subject they write. It's because of the way they write about the subject. They write about an individual, then we can see that it's not an individual only from their region or from their country. It is something that I can feel. It doesn't have to be like me, but it is something that I can understand. That's very important. In the past, literature was important as with the nation that they represent, because being part of a nation was the pride of a writer and poet, let's say about 200 years ago. But now, writers mostly try to say that I'm international writer or transnational writer. We would like to go beyond national identities, because national identities divide this world, I can say, vertically. Okay, they divide us from top to down and then create different departments. But there are certain other issues that divide us not vertically but horizontally. For example, the feeling of an individual who is depressed. That's a feeling that anyone can experience in any nation. Or the story of two lovers, or the story like the one Gospodinov just wrote, or women issue, or anti-colonialism, or LGBT matters. They are all horizontal issues that can be understood, can be written, and can be interpreted in every nation equally. So that kind of new way of divisions is, I think, the new opportunity of the literature, if it's going to be a world literature, we can call it.
Thank you for that. Wonderful. We only have maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes left here. So briefly summing up, let's say you had a chance to make some concrete suggestions to industry insiders in the publishing and literary world. What, in light of what we've been discussing, what are some concrete things that you think they could be doing to further this progress?
I think a couple of things. As a writer, I can say myself, we have to mention the name of those people putting their effort and their sweat with their love for literature, not for money. It's not just a work for a publisher or for a translator. It is something that they want to do it because they love it. So we have to always mention it. We shouldn't just pretend that I exist and my reader exists. No, there is a big family. I'm just part of that family. There are so many other people around there. And also, we have to put pressure all together. We have to put pressure on the governments, on international organizations that they should support literature more financially. For example, I have to put pressure on Turkish government and on British government that they should give more money to writers or to creative people. It's not something that we beg from them. It's our right, because the capital is not only a financial capital, it's also cultural capital we have. We produce cultural capital, and those institutions, those governments or European Union or other organizations should be more aware of that kind of production. I think that's important.
Milena, have you got any final remarks?
As it became evident, the way relationship with different literatures is formed differently, contingent on which the country and the regions are. But my little advice will be maybe go wild and don't only make safe choices. Try to explore deeper and meet people, and look up our Sudoku fiction seminars. Whenever we can reopen post-COVID, will be great to have you there so you can meet other writers and editors and publishers. and listen to Radio Trafika Europe.
Excellent suggestion. Tess?
I would just pick up something that Milena said earlier, and that is I would encourage agents, publishers, editors, translators to resist this instinct to brand. Treat each book as a universe in itself rather than seeing it as the next XYZ. Give it space and the benefit of the doubt.
What a wonderful discussion. Thanks so much to our panelists, Tess Lewis, Burhan Sönmez, and Milena Deleva.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.